Hi, my name is Ryan Byerly. I am a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Sheffield, and I'll be speaking with you about some research that my colleagues Pete Hill and Keith Edwards at Biola University and I have done on the topic of other-centeredness, a uniquely positive tendency to put others first. So I first became interested in the topic of other-centeredness several years ago when thinking about the way that we often praise people for being the kind of person that puts others' interests ahead of their own interests. We might talk this way, for example, at a eulogy when describing someone's life, or if you think back to the pandemic, sometimes we heard medical workers on the front lines of the pandemic described in this way as people who put the interests of their patients ahead of their own interests. So this suggests a hypothesis that there might be a character strength or virtue that involves tending to put others ahead of oneself, and that this virtue would be one that contributes to one's own flourishing as well as to the flourishing of others. To test this idea, we needed to develop a conceptualization of the character trait of other-centeredness, a more detailed way of thinking about what the trait involves. And then we wanted to examine whether there's any scientific evidence for thinking that it's uniquely related to indicators of flourishing. The way that we ended up conceptualizing other-centeredness is that it's a tendency that involves prioritizing others over oneself, but that involves doing so for particular reasons. So the person who's other-centered puts others' interests ahead of their own because they value other people just as much as themselves. They think that others matter just as much as they do in the grand scheme of things, and that they matter just as much as other people do in the grand scheme of things. But they also value what we call personal relationship goods. So these are goods like one person attending to another person, one person understanding another person's perspective or putting themselves in the other person's shoes. Goods like cooperating with another person or promoting friendship with that other person. Goods that require people to be related to each other in a particular way. The other-centered person recognizes that when they do something to benefit someone else, they're more likely to promote these personal relationship goods between them and the other person than when they instead do something to promote a good to benefit themselves alone, right? And that's what leads them to prioritize benefiting others. So we wanted to compare other-centeredness, understood in that way, to two other traits that also involve prioritizing others, but that follow a different logic from other-centeredness. The first of these traits is called unmitigated communion, and it's a tendency of personality that's been studied for decades, going back to the late 80s, early 90s. It also involves a tendency to prioritize others. It's just that this tendency is motivated in a different way. So people who are high in unmitigated communion feel that they can't be happy unless other people are happy. And this leads them to prioritize others' interests to their own detriment and to become overly involved in other people's problems. It's a personality feature that is thought of as largely a negative feature of personality, a liability for a person's flourishing. High other focus is the second trait that we wanted to compare other-centeredness to. It also is a tendency to prioritize others. It's thought of more as a positive feature of personality, one that might be related to humility or even a component of humility. But the interesting thing is that when we look at the way that high other focus is measured, there's nothing that indicates why the person who has high other focus prioritizes others over themselves. They might be doing it because of reasons similar to those that characterize other-centeredness, or they might be doing it for reasons similar to those that characterize unmitigated communion, or it might be for some other reasons entirely. We just don't know, given the measure alone. So we wanted to examine other-centeredness next to these two other features of personality and see whether it might be uniquely related to indicators of human flourishing. We started by looking at personality indicators of human flourishing. So these are either personality traits or sort of self-assessments that a person does of their own life. We wanted to look at, when controlling for unmitigated communion and high other focus, whether other-centeredness would be related to positive variables indicative of flourishing. And on the other hand, whether when we controlled for other-centeredness, unmitigated communion and high other focus might be related to liabilities for flourishing. And that's in fact what we found. So we found a kind of consistent pattern that other-centeredness tended to be uniquely related to positive psychological indicators of human flourishing. For example, people who are other-centered are uniquely more likely to be satisfied with their own lives, to feel that their life is full of meaning. They assess their own ability to cope with stress as being better. On the other hand, those who are high in unmitigated communion and high other focus, when we control for other-centeredness, these features are no longer related to those positive indicators of flourishing, but they do have unique relationships to negative liabilities for flourishing, such as trait neuroticism, which is also known to be related to stress and depression, stress itself, self-reported stress, as well as to what's called low self-differentiation. So unmitigated communion and high other focus are related to this tendency of self-differentiation, where low self-differentiation indicates that a person has a difficult time balancing intimacy and autonomy in close personal relationships. They have a hard time taking an I position in a relationship. They tend to entangle their own happiness with other people's happiness and to be highly reactive to others' emotional experience. Now, we didn't want to just stop there. We also wanted to look at whether other-centeredness might be uniquely related to behavioral indicators of flourishing as well. So to do this, we ran two behavioral simulations. One we called the $2 experiments. This is one in which we divided participants into two groups. One group was given 4 $2 bills. The other was given 5 $2 bills. And their task was simply to divide these $2 bills between themselves and one other unknown participant, however they wanted to. And what we found was that in the 5 $2 bill condition, people who other-centeredness was uniquely related to giving more of the $2 bills to the other person, which is what we expected. So we thought, well, if you're in that condition where you've got 5 $2 bills, you can't share them evenly between yourself and the other person. You've got to favor either them or yourself. The other-centered person might favor the other person and give more $2 bills to that other person. And that's exactly what we found. In the second behavioral simulation, what we did is we asked participants to first imagine someone that they have a close relationship to in a neutral state, where that person is neither happy or excited or sad, kind of having a dull, no emotional experience. And then we asked them to imagine that person receiving a large sum of money that they're very happy and excited about. And what we were looking at is how strong of an increase in positive feelings, positive affect that the participant themselves would have when imagining that scenario. People in general do experience more happiness when they go through this exercise. And that's true also of people who are other-centered. They also experience some growth in feelings of positive affect. But what we found is that unmitigated communion and high other focus are related to experiencing a much larger increase in feelings of positive feelings when they imagine that close other in the positive state. And that's reflective of that tendency that I was describing a moment ago of low self-differentiation, where they're highly reactive to others' emotional experience. That's not so much of a characteristic of other-centeredness. So what we find then in this research, putting it all together, is that other-centeredness does seem to be unique in comparison to these other tendencies that involve prioritizing others. And it seems to be uniquely positive. It seems to be uniquely related to indicators of flourishing, whereas these other tendencies seem to be uniquely related to liabilities for flourishing. I should emphasize that research on other-centeredness is really at an early stage, and there's a lot more that we might like to see investigated. So a few areas where we might like to see additional research would be looking at the role of other-centeredness in particular contexts. For example, the value of other-centeredness in personal relationships, or the value of other-centeredness at work, or perhaps even in particular professions like caring professions. It'd be interesting to investigate, for example, whether other-centeredness might safeguard individuals in caring professions from experiencing compassion fatigue. Thanks so much for your time.